Thank you, Mick. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's CREST seminar. It's lovely to see everyone. And yeah, I do see that there are some people here from India, so don't be shy, say hi in the chat. So today I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Baiju Gopal, who is an associate professor of psychology at Christ University, Bangalore, India. So he has over 19 years of experience in research and teaching. His areas of interest are qualitative research methodology, cultural psychology, and psychoanalysis. I myself had the pleasure of studying under him as an undergraduate student. And I have to say, in many ways, his enthusiastic way of teaching these subjects have shaped my own research interests. So speaking of research, Dr. Gopal has an extensive list of publications in various national and international journals, magazines, and books. He has also presented in various international conferences, including the Conference on Integrating South Asian Healing Traditions into Counseling and Psychotherapy, which was held at the University of Toronto in 2017. He's currently collaborating with Miami University in Ohio as the principal investigator in a research project titled A Training Model for Culturally Competent and Evidence-Based Mental Health Care in Diverse Societies. So apart from teaching and research, he is also a trained playback theater artist, a traveler, farmer, and a passionate cook. So welcome, Dr. Baiju Gopal. In today's seminar, he will be presenting his original research on indigenous healing practices, particularly shamanic healing practices as observed in a tribe of South India. He will also be exploring the implications of such an interface between divinity and healing for the practice of counseling and psychotherapy. And he'll also be exploring how we can integrate them into practice. So with that, I formally welcome you, sir, and over to you.
Thank you, Prajna, for that introduction. Good evening, professors, scholars, colleagues, and friends from different parts of the world. I'm really happy to share my research ideas and a couple of my findings in this great platform. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper and team, to create this wonderful platform to exchange our research ideas. I just would like to share my PowerPoint. All right. I have titled today's presentation as Divinity and Healing, the tradition of shamanic practices in South India. In my presentation, I based on 3 studies which I conducted. Some of the themes emerged from the studies I've included for today's presentation. One is the study on the concept of madness and its management, the Kerala scenario. The second study is the psychocultural elements in the indigenous healing practices for mental illness in Karnataka, South India, that is funded by UGC. And the third work is based on the cultural competence and evidence-based practice for diverse societies funded by USIF, which is part of the Indo-US Knowledge Initiative Award in collaboration with the Miami University, Oxford, USA. So my presentation is primarily based on this, some of the observations from these 3 studies. Before I start talking about the findings of my study, I would like to share a personal anecdote where my first confrontation with a shaman. So it was not part of a researcher, but in my childhood, I was 7 or 8 years old. That is the first time I witnessed their shamanic practice. It happened in a remote village of South India on a Friday in one of my relatives' home. So they have invited a shaman to solve a mental health problem of one of the members in the family. The shaman was a middle-aged, ordinary man. So he came home and initially interacted with the family members. And gradually he started preparing for the ritualistic practice. I vaguely remember he wore a red color dhoti. Dhoti is a traditional attire in that particular locality. So gradually he got into the trance state. So once he got into the trance state, he loudly recited some chanting or mantras. And he said, "It is a time for my deity to come. Everyone pay attention." Once he reached the peak of his trance state, he looks more and more powerful. He started talking about the secret of the family. Every family members looked really surprised by his act. Then he took a big knife in his hand and shouted at the person who was suffering with this mental health problem. And he said, "Get out from my child's body." But he was not hurting anyone. Everyone got into a fear of mysterious world of shaman. Later, he ran to the northern side of the land and put a stone there and said, "Oh, my deity, kindly protect my people from the other evil spirits." And then everyone felt protected and secured. So I'm sure many of us in this room might have witnessed, heard, or experienced similar incident about shamanic practices. Especially when we look at in the context of India. So a note from Sudhir Kakar, one of the psychoanalysts and well-known cultural psychologists, mentioned about to understand the context of shamanic practices in India. So he said, or he mentioned, the diversity and astonishing variety of number of practitioners can make a stranger to the country feel that healing in manifold aspect is a central individual and cultural preoccupation. So in India, the traditional healing practices are that apparent. So, and especially in the rural areas of India. But ironically, the academic world and mental health practitioners maintained a very safe distance. I would say a kind of diplomatic distance from the shamanic practices and the cultural heritage, and looked down at it with suspicion. So probably we need to consider the colonial legacy of India. I would say the colonialism and medical discourses are integral to each other, because psychiatry and modern mental health practice come to India along with the colonialism. So one of the challenge or problem when we look at the context of India, the psychiatry and the modern mental health movement try to homogenize the plural culture with a new language and nomenclature. Especially when you look at the asylum histories during the colonial time, you would see the attempt of homogenizing the mental health concept and practices. And definitely, we could also see a strong cultural resistance to accept the new language of psychiatry and psychology from the native people. It is very much evident how these mental health practices and the traditional healing centers are very well connected here. So when you look at the studies, almost 25, 30 years of studies, I have recorded all the studies, you could see that even today, a good number of people, probably a good percentage of people, consult a shaman, mystic, or a traditional healer during their mental health problems. Some of them consult the shaman before the therapy, some of them during the therapy, some of them after the therapy. So it's very evident in most of the existing studies that the traditional healers are often the first line of care for people with the mental illness in India. But at the same time, we can see the world, the academic world, and mental health practitioners not look at the issue with that much serious effort is not made to understand this. That is one of the irony we can see. When it comes to the first part of my presentation, very briefly describe about who's a shaman and a little bit about the different healing practices in South India. Then I come to some of my research findings. So there are different traditional healing practices can be observed in South India. But all the traditional healing practices are not shamanic. So I'm focusing mainly on the practices which are shamanic based practices. So how shamans are different from the other traditions? So some of the important characteristics when you look at different studies and conclusion is that shamans are those who voluntarily and controlled trance during the healing processes. So it is kind of they voluntarily entering the altered state of consciousness, and they claim that in that space they communicate with the spirit, or they interact with the deities, and or interact with God and his or her people. But one of the primary intention of shamanic practices is to benefit of the social group the shaman is part of. Now, when you look at South Asian understanding of shaman, is slightly different from the West. The shaman means in South India or South Asia, I would say South Asia, a wise person who knows everything. That is something different from the Western understanding of a vertical idiot or trickster, outside, psychotic, and genuinely ill. So that is very different. Shamanic practices are the integral part of rural life of the people in India. When you come to the different traditions of shamanic practices, there are many traditional shamanic practices. I'm focusing on three. One is the religious centers based practices. The second one is family based magical religious practices, and ritual dance form based practice. So my studies are primarily conducted in these three areas. So when you look at the religious centers based practices, it is part of the village culture itself. So when you travel in South India, we can find each and every corner. We can find centers where the shamanic practices take place, and some of the centers are considered as a main center. Like I have mentioned few. You can read that Chodanikara temple, Ukkadagatri temple in Karnataka, Bhimapalli, it's a mosque, Kodungalur temple. These are some of the very well-known centers in South India where shamanic practices take place. And the shamans will have different local names here. For example, in Malayalam, in one of the vernacular language mentioned as Velichapadanman, Mantravadis, etc. These are some of the vernacular or local name for shamans. The second type of shamanic practices, which I want to quickly mention about the ritual dance form based practices. So the ritual dance forms are more ceremonial in nature. So the purpose of this dance form is primarily ritual, performing a ritual. So one of the such practice called Theyyam practice, which we can find in the northern part of Kerala, South India. So this practice actually narrate the stories of a cultural hero. So there were human beings who fought for a justice and truth in the society, and unnatural and untimely death due to battle and murder made them resurrect as a deity. So the Theyyam performance are primarily narrate the story of this process. And the shamanic consultation is also happen during this performance. So I just put it by PowerPoint. The Theyyam stories primarily depict the transformation of an ordinary individual into God. So how a powerless person who is subjected to all sort of world's oppression and cheating will be able to revive as a strong, powerful God who is above all these worldly boundaries through the Theyyam performance. So this is something, one type of practice we can find in South Kerala, which is called, sorry, North Kerala, which is called Theyyam practice. The second one is called Bhuda Kola. I have a very short 1-minute video from my field note. I would like to share that just to understand this. So I'll just share that you will get an idea about these particular form. Buddha Kola, a short video I have, just be able to play this.
Many of these theatrical art forms provide a cultural space to interact and celebrate the life in its fullness. In that sense, these art forms serve functions of social harmony, community get-togetherness, and intense belongingness. This element of Bhuta Kola is an integral part of the healing for mental illness.
All right. So that is a short video of Buddha Kola, part of the documentary what we developed about the indigenous healing practice in Karnataka. So this is basically we can find in the coastal Karnataka. It is kind of a highly stylized version of the ritual dance of the spirit enacts God for their community and personifies the role which take their people through a magical trance. When you look at it, both these ritual dance form, both Buddha Kola and Theyyam performance, this is primarily performed by marginalized section in the community. So that is something important. The tribes who perform this are Valen tribes, and there are a couple of other tribes who are marginalized in the community. They perform this. Another one is the religious family base, where you probably can find a particular case here. I would just like to share 1-minute video for this as well. Then I'll come to some of my thematic presentations. Yeah, this is about the magical religious practice, which you can watch here. All right, here we go.
Magico-religious tradition. In this tradition, various forms of practices can be observed. Kallaipune and Mata Mantra are the two strong traditions in healing mental aberrations. They are considered to be specialized forms of magical practices to heal the problems of people. Healing based on herbal medicine is not only from the organized Ayurvedic tradition, but certain unorganized healers can also be seen in the community. The possession problems for a Kallaipune practitioner will not come under the broad category of mental illnesses. There are specialized prescriptions given for these problems, and these ingredients are required for the treatment of such problems. A client is brought to Venkappa Nalike in Puttur, who is a Kallaipune practitioner with a complaint of not speaking to anyone at all for the last 8 days. The first step in the treatment is applying bhasma on the client's forehead and hands. Then, the healer makes a special knot in the thread by reciting sacred mantra, and then it is tied to his neck. We could now see a change in his bodily movements and posture. He became more energetic now and started talking also. According to his parents, he was taken to 3 allopathic hospitals, did a CT scan, and even to other community healers.
All right. So that is from another field note from the family-based magical religious practice. I'm not going to talk more about that, just to get a brief overview of these practices. So when you look at the concept of divinity in these practices, mostly this originated outside the traditional Hindu ideologies. So many of these deities and their descriptions we cannot find in the Hindu religious text. So we can find most of these narrations and stories in oral tradition, so that there are multiple stories about one particular deity or god or goddesses. And some of these goddesses or gods are not very calm and tranquil. They're very naughty. Some of the, for example, I was mentioned here about about a deity called Chatan. Chatan Seva is one of the very powerful deity in shamanic practices. His favorite offering is alcohol, and he do a lot of naughty things. So that is very well known in the oral traditions. Now, when you come to some of the important aspect or themes which we identified from these two studies, primarily the psychocultural study and the madness study we conducted in Kerala. So one is about the common beliefs of shaman. So when we look at the shamanic practices, it's primarily worked in a cultural context, and also based on the beliefs of the shaman and the beliefs of the people of shaman as well. So that's a context where the shamanic practices primarily take place. So in that, there are three aspects important in this belief. One is about the space of the healing. So for the shaman, the space or the context of healing is very important. So the rituals are mostly conducted in a sacred, according to them, sacred and powerful places, which would influence a ritual in a positive way. So they choose the site for the performance, especially the shamanic performance. They choose based on the severity of the problem. If the treatment for a major problem, the rituals is conducted in a graveyard or a major religious center. But for a minor problems, the healer consult in their place or even client's house considers adequate. So the place is very important. And the second thing about the concept about body, here they believe that the body is seen as part of the larger environmental field where the ritualistic transference of energy or spirit occurs. That is slightly different from our understanding in our Western medicine. Many other researchers also cited the same. For example, Krippner and Haynes supported the similar argument. In Western medicine, the body is treated like a machine that needs frequent repair. But in native medicine, the body is seen as a dynamic system, as an energy field within a larger context. So the shaman consider if they are in a place or a space, that itself is sufficient for them to get the energy to perform. So this all work based on the beliefs of shaman. The third aspect about the common belief is about an inviting atmosphere. So that in traditional healing practices, a lot of attention is given for the arrangement of the physical setting where the rituals take place. This arrangement is believed to create an inviting atmosphere for the spirit, which also act as a medium in the process. So this is something, some of the common beliefs we could find across the shamanic practices. These are some of the themes emerged from the study. The second aspect about the role of shaman in the healing process. So the role of the shaman is a kind of a mediator between two worlds. This is something many other researchers also cited. The two worlds, the world of the deity and the world of the people. They claim that they have an intimate connection with the deity. So some of the possibility how they are developing that kind of a connection with the deity or goddesses or god is through a strong identification with the deity. How they are identifying with the deity through the repeated ritual practices. Sometimes their one-time vote to the deity, and also their contemplative practices and dedication, the dedication to such narratives and stories of that particular society or about the deity. So that gives them a kind of a strong identification, which they feel an intimate connection with the deity. And they believe that sometimes they are become the messenger of that deity. They have a very strong faith and belief about that, which help them to carry the spirit or readiness to carry the spirit. So their primary role is to connect between these two worlds. They are a mediator between the people and the deity. So, but it's interesting question. Always we could ask why this god or deity need a mediator. So most of this deity and god are very powerful. So why they need a mediator? So here we could see a very interesting cultural dynamics, especially a culture which believe more in interdependence. So it is affirming that God can act only in a relational context. And this space is primarily to understanding each other's language. It is also an arrangement to rethink about the relational world and also space for ask many relevant questions. So the God will only act in a relational context and in a relational world is an interesting observation we could see from this practice of shaman. And especially when you look at in South India, we can see a very complex caste relationship here. And the hierarchy between the caste are very annoyingly evident, right? So that is a scenario in South India. But in the shamanic practices, it is also somewhere proposing an alternative to this. Here, they're kind of recreating an interdependent caste relationship. Those who have studied or understood about the South Asia and especially in India, the caste system is a bigger challenge or problem here. And we can see the images of oppression in these practices. But the interesting point, most of these performers, the shamanic performers or shamans, are coming from the downtrodden community or a marginalized section. For example, I mentioned about the Theyyam practices. So these Theyyam practitioners, once they wear the costumes of the Theyyam, the entire society consider them as god or deity or goddesses. Then even the oppressor, most of the time the oppressor are the higher caste. Even they bow down on that particular day and listen to the wisdom of this oppressed. And very interesting thing, even preparing non-vegetarian food is a prohibition in Brahmin's house. Brahmins are the upper caste in South India. But on the particular day of Theyyam performance, even the Theyyam performers are allowed to cook non-vegetarian food in the courtyards of the Brahmin house. So we could see a kind of a rearrangement or a recreating an interdependent caste relationship is a quite fascinating a fascinating idea which emerged from the shamanic practice. And fourth aspect about when you look at the problem, especially the genesis of disturbances, where especially in the context of mental health scenario, this question is relevant. What is the genesis? Where is the origin of a particular, right? In modern understanding or in our psychological understanding, uh, the genesis of disturbance to the self is originated from the early family connections. So that is the maximum we could able to access. But in the shamanic practices, they are also considering it is not only the origin of the problem from the family members or the early family connections. It's also like ancestral spirits or something what you call pitras. So their role is also identified in the shamanic practices. And also, it is not only the shaman is doing, there is also a collective effort of the other elements or components like astrologers. The astrologers come in place and the astrologers will identify what is original. Is it coming from the family? Is it coming from the society? If it's coming from the ancestral spirit, accordingly, they propose what kind of a solution is appropriate. So there's a different understanding about the genesis of disturbance in shamanic traditions. And the fifth aspect, the fifth major idea which I wanted to share is about the medical metaphor to a religious spiritual metaphor, which is primarily coming from the idea that the involvement and integration of the patient's relatives in the healing process is very important. The In shamanic practices, there is an effort to bridge between the sick and normal members in the society or family. For instance, in many shamanic traditions and traditional healing practices, if a close relative of a patient prays a deity that he or she is ready to take the distress, then the Buddha or spirit often leaves the patient and processes the supplicant. We can definitely ask this question whether it is really happening or not. It looks very superstitious. But the idea here is it is strongly proposing or affirming that normal and possessed are indistinct. That means anytime anyone can get this. You are also not an exemption from this. So that kind of a, bridge between the sick and normal members offer something to the client, which help the client to overcome the moral worthlessness and feeling of isolation they experience when they go through the distress. That's a very fascinating idea which emerged from the field work and field observation. And this is also quite interesting, where I considered why this, um, I mean, uh, uh, the shamanic practices are very, very effective in many contexts. Why people are still going to the shamans? Why they still not considering seriously about going to a mental health professional? And why are they confused about? So one interesting thing is the shaman most of the time fulfill the cultural expectation of a healer. So most of the time, we can see shaman are representing them as a superior individual in relation to people of his or her community, because they have a very strong body and mind through the various contemplative practices and uh, their training, their lifestyle, they're able to develop that. Similarly, you can see in this picture, in these photographs, you can see the shaman walk on fire, you know, and shaman can perform. In the second slide, you can see that one of the martial art form called Kalaripayattu. So one very difficult martial arts. And during the Theyyam performance, that is one of the shamanic performance, these shamans perform the most difficult steps of Kalaripayattu. So that is actually offering to the patients or the society that shaman is a superior individual, and also proving the psychic potential of human being. In a different sense, we can say it is nothing but the psychic potential of human being. Not only the physical ability of the shaman, and the cognitive abilities of shamans are quite impressive. So I have conducted and observed a cult form called Siri cult in South Canada, South Karnataka, where the Siri cult is actually narrating the epic or the story of the goddesses Siri. It is like 15,000 lines of songs. There is no written script for that. It's in Tulu language. And the shaman is able to uh, remember all these 15,000 lines, and they're able to connect with the society, connect to the community through these songs. So the shaman's cognitive abilities are often very impressive. There are many other studies observed in the West also, the shaman's cognitive abilities. So what I'm trying to say is that through these personal qualities and presenting them as a superior individual, their ability to remember the cultural myths and cognitive ability, in a way, they are kind of fulfilling an idea of an ideal healer. So what an ideal healer is in a society like South India, where very hierarchical, expecting a ready-made solution for everything, and how a problem can be magically resolved. You know, such kind of an ideal heroes. So they are heroes. So that is one of the important aspect where shamanic practices are working from our observation. And because any practices, when you look at the effectiveness, is primarily rest upon how much the worlds of these two healers are communicating, right? So here they're kind of fulfilling the image of an ideal healer. And but what is happening in our therapy room is very, very interesting and fascinating. So every day, especially in India, um, we are trying to translate the language of this client to a common something, a nomenclature which the client is not very familiar. Deeply they are not familiar. In their deeper psyche, they are not very familiar. They are not rooted there. Yeah, it has an implication definitely in the West. It can implication where it is originated, but there is a problem we're directly importing and utilizing in our cultural context. So so this is something, an irony, a crisis, what we are facing in the mental health scenario. My colleagues are here. Probably some of them may add later their experience as well. But the shaman is actually sharing a common worldview, uh, where much matching we can find between the people and the idea about the illness, the idea about the healing, the idea about the causality of the problem. There are more similarity we can find between shaman and people in South India in a cultural sense. I wanted to bring a little bit from a little bit of a practical point of view, which is part of the study what we have done in the Indo-US Knowledge Initiative Award. We have done a survey, focus group, and interview with a different group of people across India to understand how much training, um, especially to understand this kind of cultural nuances and cultural issues, how competent are our system to deal with this kind of problem. So what we found is quite interesting. There is very limited training received in cultural competence, mostly in Indian scenario. So when you looked at two cultures like in India and US, what we found was like mostly infusion is one of the major way how the cultural competence training is happening in India. The infusion is happening in US also, but there are much more clinical and research experiences we could found in US, but in India, in the cultural competence area, though we are very diverse in our cultures, when you travel from the south to north, we can find a huge diversity, but we don't have sufficient mechanism to understand this diversity and address this diversity and develop cultural competence among the mental health professionals is something, an important issue we need to discuss and debate. And in our focus group, discussion also, the kind of training received in cultural competence, we found that there are mostly many observations coming. There is no training. Many universities have no training, very minimal training, or a single course. One or two universities observe a single course in cultural competence, and there are no coursework, but some practical clinical experience. That is the scenario. There is no sufficient training to address the cultural competence is one of the major problem probably that need to be addressed practically, considering the relevance of cultural beliefs and faith and ideas of people about mental health. So of course, in South India or India, the integration between the Western oriented psychotherapeutic practices and the indigenous healing practices is not emerged. There are efforts happen here and there, but it is not emerged well as the way it need to be. Some of my propositions are like one possible way we can look at is much more attention need to give and to understand the cultural competence and developing more cultural competent trainings to understand this kind of cultural nuances. And it is also important not to suppress. We have a history where all these cultural ideas were suppressed and denied, but that still continued. So that rather than just suppression, inclusion and understanding of these practices will be much helpful to develop an effective training models and practices here. Probably some of the model we can see in, for instance, in the efforts doing in universities like Toronto or Canada. I mean, again, we need to learn from them. I mean, the indigenous healers are trained in the other modern psychotherapeutic practices as well. They're trained in both. So the communities, those who are not comfortable to go to another, another ethnic group or the people and their background, so they go to the people, those who are trained in both. They're trained in indigenous healing practice and also they're trained in the modern psychotherapeutic practice. Probably that is that these are some of the efforts happening all over the world, how to integrate these traditional healing practices and psychotherapeutic practices. So an authentic dialogue between different traditions will be more appropriate. Instead of suppressing and excluding these practices, saying that it is not scientific and there is no root, that is I mean, to understand and dialoguing will be a better option. Impose a universalization by one set of indigenous idea also will inhibit the disciplinary progress. So whether it is East, West, and again, it is not a solution to go back to the traditional healing practices. I'm not proposing that. But it is important to understand and the ideas, understand the beliefs, and how do we integrate that into psychotherapeutic practice is an important question and challenge for academicians and the practitioners of mental health. So I would like to stop here with this note, and I'm happy to take some of your questions and your comments and observations.